All right, Shabbos, say good morning, good morning. Let us begin by thanking our sponsors, our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Av, Max and Brenda Lapkovsky, in honor of the upcoming bar mitzvah of their son Yitzchak Meir, Dr. Riva Mitzner, in commemoration of the first yarzheit of her father, Dr. Larry Schneck, Aryeh Ben Chaim. Thank you. And Jack Bennett in honor of Sergeant Cmr Tviv, who was killed by a Hamas Anti-Tank Missile on the Gaza border on May 12th, 2021. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah and the families a nechama. So with that, let us begin. We really have an exceptional daf ahead of us today, which actually is going to open up what is really going to be an incredibly exciting sugya. So let's begin. We got all the way yesterday on the Chaf He, we got to the Mishnah. So let's pick up from the Mishnah this morning. So the Mishnah says as follows: Shluchei mitzvah peturim min Succah. It was a very exciting sugya. Just, this is going to be the sugya of osik b'mitzvah patra min mitzvah. The concept, ultimately, again, that when you're engaged in the performance of one mitzvah, by definition, you are exempt from other mitzvahs. So the parameters of that we'll have to define. But in any event, the Mishnah says, Shluchei mitzvah patra min Succah. Now, the lashon over here is very interesting. Shluchei mitzvah means what? So people who are on a mitzvah mission, people who have been dispatched to perform a mitzvah, are pater from Sukkah. Now look at Rashi, because it's actually quite interesting. Rashi says, Shluchei mitzvah, holchei b'derech mitzvah. These are people who are on the way to the performance of a mitzvah. For example, kigon, lilmod. Although interestingly enough, you could see over here in Agos v'tziyunim, he quotes over here that there is a different girsa that says lilamed, right? Two different girsos. Either people who are going to learn Torah, or people who are going to teach Torah, okay, lilmod lamed, lilmod Torah, lahakbil pnei rabo, a person who's traveling to go out and see his Rebbe, or the biliftos shvuyim, or a person who's going to redeem captives. Now I will say, what I want to point out, what's interesting about the way Rashi's understanding this opening phrase is, are you actively involved in the performance of a mitzvah? No, what are you doing? You're traveling. Because we'll say, here's what's interesting. The Mishnah, and we're going to see, assumes that it's obvious that if you're actively performing a mitzvah, of course you're exempt. You're exempt from the performance of another mitzvah. According to Rashi, what the Mishnah is adding in over here is shluchei mitzvah. I'm on the way. So I'm not actively performing a mitzvah right now. I'm on the way to go ahead and perform the mitzvah pidyon shvuyim. I'm on the way to see my Rebbe. I'm on the way to yeshiva to learn. I'm on the way to go ahead and give a shir. I'm not actively involved, but I'm involved in the journey to get to the mitzvah. We're going to see that's also called osik b'mitzvah. That's also called being involved in the mitzvah, and therefore one would be pater from Sukkah. Similarly, cholin umisham shemehen, a person who's ill, and anyone who is attending to the ill person, peturim min Sukkah. Ultimately, again, is pater from Sukkah as well. All right, so one last piece. Ochlin v'shos chut l'Sukkah. So we'll say third piece of this is that, again, you are permitted to go and eat and drink arai. Now we'll have to define that statement in the Gemara, but arai, on the most basic level, means a snack, right? As opposed to achilas keva, which is a meal. Arai will be arai literally means temporary. Like we've seen that lashon all the time in Sukkah, a more temporary type of eating, a snack. So we'll say essentially three distinct halachas. Halacha number one is that if you're on the way to perform a mitzvah, you are pater from Sukkah. Halacha number two, a person who is ill and anyone taking care of the ill person is pater from Sukkah. Halacha number three is you're allowed to eat achilas arai outside of the Sukkah. But I'll just point out here something very interesting. So Tosas here points out, he says, if in Tosas Divrei Maschil Shluchei Mitzvah. So if you look at the end of Tosas, the whole Tosas happens to be very interesting, but if you look at the end of Tosas, the last 2, 4, 6, like 8 lines, where Tosas says, Elavadai, lo miftar ela b'shashu osik ba, kigon talish alaveda v'shot chalatzarchas. So we'll say, Tosas here is actually trying to understand the parameters of osik b'mitzvah, pater min mitzvah, because essentially that's the concept. And Tosas explains. I'll just tell you this outside. He gives the following example. There's a mitzvah that if you find a lost object, to go ahead and hold on to it until you could find the owner. So let's say I find a wallet. I have it in my house. So what does that mean? That the entire time I have the wallet in my house, I'm pater from the performance of any other mitzvah because I'm osik in the mitzvah of Hashavas Haveda. So Tosfos says, of course, that's not how it works. That the way it works ultimately is that when you are actively involved or engaged in the performance of one mitzvah, that exempts you from other mitzvahs. But when you are not actively engaged, you're not pater. What about Sukkah? So how does that stem with what we said in the Mishnah over here? So remember again, both say Sukkah is different a little bit. Why? Because what does Sukkah anchor to? What does Sukkah anchor to? A place. And specifically what? Really your home. Your home. So when you're traveling for the sake of the performance of a mitzvah, essentially you're away from your home. That iskos, that involvement is enough to pater you from Sukkah. But this does not actually create a paradigm for everything else. So like, for example, if I'm going ahead and I'm traveling for the mitzvah Pidyon Shavuyim, am I pater from Tefillin? Am I pater from Tefillin? No, right? Why? Because that could easily be performed in concert with my traveling. So the point, according to Tosfos, that what it means when we say Osik Mitzvah Patam Mitzvah it means when you're involved in the mitzvah, you are actively exempt from any other mitzvah which would interfere with the mitzvah you are performing. But if the mitzvahs can be performed in concert, then ultimately, again, there's no exemption. Again, we'll flesh this out a little bit more as time goes on, but you'll take a look at this Tosfos. It's Sunday. Nobody has any plans. It's supposed to rain. Right? So, so you have some time today. Take a look at the Tosfos. Quite incredible. Good. We'll say, says the Gemara. Minahanimili. We'll say, where do I know this concept that osik b'mitzvah pater min ha-mitzvah? The Tan Rabbanan, because we learned, listen to this, b'shiftecha b'veisecha, prat la'osik b'mitzvah, u'b'lechtecha b'derech, prat l'chosen. So let's listen to this. So the Gemara says this entire halacha learned from Kriyas Shema. The pasuk says, v'shinamtu l'vanecha v'dibarta bam, when v'dibarta bam, now dibarta bam means when do you have to be involved in mitzvahs? B'shiftecha b'veisecha, when you're sitting in your home. What does that come to teach me? Prat la'osik b'mitzvah. That comes to exclude someone who is actively involved in a mitzvah. So when am I obligated to engage in mitzvahs? Ultimately, again, when I'm sitting in my home. Sitting in my home is representative of engaged in my own affairs, as opposed to what? As opposed to halacha l'maisa, being involved in a mitzvah. So when I'm engaged in my own affairs, that's v'dibarta bam. Then I have an obligation to engage in mitzvahs. Similarly, again, u'b'lechtecha b'derech, when I'm walking on my way, meaning I'm engaged in my own affairs, that comes to exclude a chasan. That a chasan on his wedding night, ultimately, again, is going to be pater from Kriyas Shema. Mikan Amru, from here we see, hakones es ha-besula, if a man marries a besula, pater, ultimately, again, he is pater from Kriyas Shema. He's pater from Kriyas Shema. V'yes ha-hamana chayiv. But if he marries an almana, a widow, he's going to be chayav in Kriyas Shema. Now, before we go on, take a look at Rashi. First white line in Rashi. V'lechtecha b'derech prat l'chasan. This is great. V'yafagav dehu nami b'mitzvah tarid. So we'll say, now here's what's interesting. So just before we go on, there are two drushas over here. But amazingly enough, the two drushas are what? They're really the same drasha, right? B'shiftecha b'veisecha teaches me what? Let's go through this. B'shiftecha b'veisecha teaches me when I'm sitting in my home represents what? Involved in my own affairs, that's when I'm chayav in mitzvahs, right? But let's say again, if I'm actively involved in a mitzvah, one mitzvah, I'm exempt from the performance of other mitzvahs. V'lechtecha b'derech means same idea. When I'm walking on my way, doing my thing, I'm obligated to mitzvahs. But a chasan who got married, and Abba said there's a tirda, what is he preoccupied with? The Bia Rishona, the consummating the marriage, the first act of relations. That's a mitzvah. And because that weighs on his mind, because he's involved in that, therefore he's exempt from Shema. But say, it's the same drasha. It's the same drasha. It's the same halacha. Right? It's the same concept. When you're engaged in a mitzvah, you are exempt from other mitzvos. So Rashi's bothered by this. Why do I need two drashas? So watch this. Look at Rashi. This is incredible. Rashi says, Va'afa gab tehunami b'mitzvah tarid. It's the same drasha, v'lechtecha b'derech, that exempts a chasan from Kriyas Shema, from mitzvahs, is the same drasha of b'shiftecha b'veisecha. Nevertheless, Rashi says, it's trichi luhu trei kroi. You need both psukim. Why? Di hava ksiv chad, kevan de chasan lav behedja ksiv b'kra, hava amina lo patra akasav ela toreach V'ose melachas or melachas mitzvah biadayim. O mahalech lemitzvah. Aval chasen shu yoshev ubatel ve'ena osek elitarid b'machshavas be'ilah lo pater hakasav. Hilchach nikra yisera ashmo'inon de pater mikriyashma de tarid b'machshavas be'ilah. This is incredible. Tosa says the two phrases teach me two different things. B'shivtecha b'veisecha teaches me what? Physical preoccupation. When I'm physically preoccupied with the performance of one mitzvah, I'm exempted from another mitzvah. Belechtecha b'derech, which comes to teach me to exclude a chasan, speaks about what? Mental preoccupation. That a person is mentally preoccupied with another mitzvah, ultimately again, or I should say a person is mentally preoccupied with one mitzvah that exempts it from the performance of another mitzvah. Now the truth is, the only case of mental preoccupation with a mitzvah is right. Bosa, this would be a great one to use. I'm sorry, I can't do anything right now. I'm mentally occupied with thinking about a mitzvah. So the only exemption this actually brings up is chasan. There's only really one case like this. But again, even though they're both utilizing the same principle, namely, osek b'mitzvah patra min mitzvah. When you're engaged in the performance of one mitzvah, you're exempt from another mitzvah. Each phrase teaches me a different manifestation of that principle. B'shivtecha b'veisecha, physical preoccupation. Uvelechtecha b'derech, mental preoccupation. Incredible. So back to the Gemara. My mashma. So we'll say, so first of all, how exactly are you deriving this from the pasuk? Some Rafuna, kiderech. Because we'll say, look what the pasuk says. The pasuk says, uvelechtecha b'derech. Ma derech rishus. Just like the derech, going down the road, represents an optional matter. Afkol rishus. So therefore, again, when am I obligated? When am I obligated to go and engage in mitzvahs? When I'm stam walking down the road. Walking down the road means being involved in regular everyday things. Lafuke hai dibe mitzvah, to exclude ultimately the chasan, who is mentally preoccupied with the future performance. Now, boss, I want to point out over here, you of course understand, it's not talking about that the chasan is actually performing the Bia Rishona, that he's exempt from Kriya Shema. That's obvious. He can't say Shema, right, when engaging in active relations. What it's saying is he's mentally preoccupied with going to be performing the Bia Rishona. I'm sorry, back to the Gemara. Av kol rishus lafuki hayda mitzvah asuk. Milo askinan dekazlo dvar. So how do you know? Maybe belechtecha baderech is talking about someone who's going to perform a mitzvah. In other words, the Gemara is saying belechtecha baderech. Derech means the performance of some non-mitzvah matter. When are you obligated to perform mitzvahs? When you're engaged in some other non-mitzvah performing matters. But if you're performing the mitzvah, you're exempted from other mitzvahs. How do you know that says the Gemara? How do you know Balechtacha Baderech means a derech, a non-mitzvah derech? Maybe the derech being referred to over here, ultimately again, is a mitzvah. And the Torah is telling me that even if you're performing a mitzvah, you're not exempted from the performance of other mitzvahs. Imkein lemakra b'sheves uveleches. The Torah could have then said b'sheves b'veisecha or b'sheves b'bayis when you sit in your home. Ubeleches baderech, but it doesn't say that. Instead, what does it do? B'shiftecha ubelechtecha, possessive. My b'shiftecha ubelechtecha, beleches didoch hu demechayeves. When you're walking for your own purposes, in other words, you're engaged in your own activities of daily living, that's when you are obligated in mitzvahs. Habuleches the mitzvah pitiras. But again, ultimately, if you're involved in the walking, so to speak, of a mitzvah, as you're engaged in the performance of a mitzvah, you'll be exempt from other mitzvahs. If that's the case, so I'll say fine. So now I understand that b'shiftecha b'veisecha. That phrase teaches me that in general, when am I obligated in mitzvahs? B'shiftecha b'veisecha, when I'm sitting in my home. In other words, I'm engaged in my own activities of daily living. But if I am actively involved in the performance of one mitzvah, by definition, what? I'm exempted from other mitzvahs. Okay, same idea. When I'm walking on my way, doing my things in life, that's when ultimately, again, I'm going to be obligated in mitzvahs. But a chasan who is preoccupied, intellectual, mentally preoccupied with a mitzvah, ultimately is going to be exempted from other mitzvahs. So if that's the case, says the Gemara, why is the mental preoccupation of a mitzvah only limited to when a man marries a basula? Why is it not? Why doesn't it apply ultimately again when he's marrying an almana as well? In other words, the mental preoccupation is with the mitzvah period of arivia, procreation, right? Of having children, a bia rishona, which is a mitzvah. The bia rishona is a mitzvah whether you're marrying a basula, whether you're marrying an almana. So why isn't he exempt no matter who he is marrying? Afilu achi, konis es almana nami. So the Gemara says, konis es habasula tarid, konis almana lo tarid. To which the Gemara says, Rabbi say, here's the difference. When a man is marrying a basula, there is a certain level of enhanced preoccupation. When he's marrying an almana, there is not that same level of preoccupation. Look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, Tarid, libo tar machshavas bila, umistabra ki patre kra mishum tir de patre, ve'eno yachal laso b'shain kecher. So we'll say, just the Gemara is giving a very intuitive answer. When it's a basula, ultimately, again, there's more involved in the act of the bia rishona. So because of that, the chassan is more preoccupied with it, even though, again, the bia rishona with an almana is also going to be a mitzvah, but the tirta is not there. So we'll say, what the Gemara just did is the Gemara just made a major shift, because it turns out that the exemption of the chassan on his wedding night is not simply an exemption of osek b'mitzvah patra min mitzvah. Because if that was the nature of the exemption, then what? Then no matter who you're marrying, there should be the exemption. The exemption of the chassan on his wedding night, yes, is osek b'mitzvah patra min mitzvah, coupled with tirda. Tirda, Rabosai, means preoccupation. Preoccupation, or literally tirda means something weighing heavily on your mind. That tirda is associated with a bia rishona with a basula. Not associated with the bia rishona with a woman who's not a basula. There's an extra level of tirda that comes with that. So we'll say, so this is quite interesting. So now we've just added on another layer. Now it's not only osik b'mitzvah patam min mitzvah that allows you to be exempt, but tirda also. The Gemara says, really? So you're telling me now, anytime there's tirda, anytime you're mentally preoccupied, you're exempt from mitzvahs? You're exempt from Kriyat Shema. So the Gemara says, "V'chol heicha detarid hachanami depater." Wow, listen. Now just understand, you've really opened up. There are some people who are always tarid, right? Some people are always preoccupied with something. So that means anytime I'm preoccupied, and also when I say preoccupied, it means there's something weighing heavily on my mind. Anytime there's something I'm exempt from Shema. Elamiyata taba sinas sabayam. Right? So I will say. So again, if that's the case, I'm a merchant and my ship sunk. Or perhaps to make this a little more contemporary, right? The market dipped, right? The market dipped. So again, anytime, maybe I'm suffering a financial loss, which I'm going to say for most of us, if we're having financial issues, ein tirda gedola mizo, right? There is no mental preoccupation greater than that. Maybe you'll say it should be pater also. Maybe we'll say yeah, maybe that is. Maybe that if your boat sinks, we'll say, not that if your boat sinks and you're on it. Yeah, I think we all say if your boat sinks and you're on it, you're patur from Kriyat Shema. Right? We're talking about, again, I'm a merchant, and I just got word that my boat carrying my merchandise is sinking. Right? And my portfolio, my broker called me in a panic. So again, is that a reason to be patur from Shema? Maybe you'll say yes. Maybe it is. Well, if that's the case, Avel Chayiv b'chol hamitzvos ha'amuros b'Torah. You both say that can't be true. Why? Because an avel, a mourner, someone who has lost one of the 7 close relatives for whom they're obligated to sit shiva, to mourn for, ultimately, again, is chayiv in all mitzvahs. Chutz minat tefillin, with the exception of tefillin, which we'll talk about. Sheinamar bahen fe'er. Because we'll say by tefillin, which we're going to talk about this on Amud Beis, the Navi uses lashon of fe'er. Fe'er means glory. So an avel is chayiv in all mitzvos, except ultimately for what? For tefillin. Again, until we'll talk about this. So we'll say, now again, when you think about somebody who has a mental preoccupation or is weighed down by overwhelming thoughts, an avel is a pretty good example. So if it was true that Allah might say anytime you have mental preoccupation, you're patur from mitzvahs, then an avel should be patur from mitzvahs, yet an avel is not patur from mitzvahs. So I'll say, now watch this. To which the Gemara gives an incredible answer. Hacha tarid tirda de mitzvah. Hasam tarid tirda derishos. Rabbi say, here's the fundamental difference. At the end of the day, a chassan, when his tirda, right, his preoccupation is with a mitzvah. An avel, his tirda is not a mitzvah. Rabbi say, interestingly enough, in halacha, there is an obligation, a mitzvah, to engage in behaviors associated with mourning. There is no obligation that governs how you're supposed to feel. In other words, there's no obligation, so to speak, to have intellectual mourning or emotional mourning, right? An avel is obligated to sit shiva. An avel is obligated to go ahead and ter kriya. An avel is obligated to go ahead and say kaddish. But there is no mitzvah that says about an avel's emotion. So therefore, again, if the avel is sad and overwhelmed by sadness, that's not a mitzvah. That's not a mental preoccupation with a mitzvah. The mitzvah of avelus are behavioral. Masha'en kain the chassan, his tirda is with the performance of a mitzvah. He's going to have the Bia Rishona. He's going to be engaging in the Bia Rishona. There's understandably, of course, again, if you think about the classic case of a chassan in the first marriage, there's understandably a tirda Rishona associated with that, and therefore halacha l'maisa, he is exempt from the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema. So we'll say, so what turns out over here is something very interesting. So we're creating multiple levels. So level one is, let's say, taking Tosas' idea. The classic case of osik b'mitzvah pater min mitzvah is you're actively engaged in the performance of one mitzvah that exempts you from performing anything else, right? Our Mishnah expanded that a little bit more to say that even if you're actively engaged in the process to perform a mitzvah, you may be exempted from other mitzvahs as well, specifically Succah. Now what we're adding on is an additional level, that if you are actively preoccupied with the performance of the mitzvah, even though what? You're not performing the mitzvah yet, but there's an active level of preoccupation, you're also exempted from the mitzvah. Again, the really only example of this that halacha seems to accept as legitimate mental preoccupation is a chassan on his wedding night with Kriyat Shema. But again, tava svinasa bayam, right? Your boat sinks, or an avel, even though is there mental preoccupation? Of course, but that's not considered to be mental preoccupation with what? With a mitzvah, right? That's mental preoccupation, that's a rishus. That's your choice to be mentally preoccupied, and therefore that does not create an exemption from mitzvah. So the Gemara says, therefore again, we've established, just so you understand, very exciting day, we've established that the source for the concept of osik b'mitzvah pater min mitzvah comes b'shiftecha b'veisecha or b'lechtecha b'derech. B'shiftecha b'veisecha, teaching us that if I'm actively, we'll call it physically involved in a mitzvah, I'm exempt from another mitzvah. Or b'lechtecha b'derech, if I'm cognitively involved or cognitively preoccupied with a mitzvah, ultimately again I am exempt from another mitzvah. To which the Gemara says, really? Va'osik b'mitzvah pater min mitzvah b'hacha nafka? Do we really learn it out from here? I thought we learned that from somewhere else. I thought we learned that from a second source. Pesach Sheni. Where do we have Pesach? This time, listen to this. Remember again, the pasuk says in Chumash Bamidbar that there were individuals who were tmeim lenefesh. They were tamei, ritually impure, and they came to Moshe. Right? They say we were unable to go ahead and offer up Pesach Rishon. Lamani gara. Why should we lose out? And this ultimately is the beginning of the section of Pesach Sheni. They make up Pesach. So the Gemara says something amazing. Why were they tamei? Why were these people tamei? So the Gemara says, Anoshim, the Gemara says, Osem Anoshim, Mihayu. Both say this is incredible. Who were these people who were unable to perform Korban Pesach in the desert? Who were they? Mihayu, Anose Arono Shal Yosef, Hayudir Yosef Levi. Incredible. They both say these were the Jews who were carrying the casket of Yosef. Carrying the casket of Yosef. We'll say, remember again, before Yosef dies, end of Chumash Bereshis, Yosef makes his brothers swear, right? That what? When you go ahead and leave Mitzrayim, va'alisem es atzmosai mizeh itchem. When you leave, you have to take my remains. A very moving medrash about the Egypt. Well, okay, the Egyptians. No, not for now. We'll say so again. So therefore, again, the people who were carrying the casket of Yosef, they were tamei. They were Thomas. They come to Moshe. It's a little fair. Well, what's going on over here? We're doing a mitzvah. We're going and carrying the remains of Yosef, and we lose out on Pesach. That's Rabbi Yosef Lili's approach. So we'll say Amud Beis. Rabbi Akiva says no. Mishael ve'al tzafan hayu shayu oski benadav v'aviyu. Wow. Rabbi Akiva says no. It was actually the two remaining sons. I'm sorry, actually the cousins, right? The cousins of the nephews of Aaron who were involved in taking care of the bodies of Nadav and Avihu, Mishal and Tzafan, the nephews of Aaron, who were tummy because they took care of the bodies of Nadav and Avihu. Either Rabbi Yitzchak Omer, Rabbi Yitzchak says it doesn't make sense. Im nose Aaron shel Yosef hayu, kivar hayu yecholin litar. It's not true. In other words, that if we're talking about the Jews who were carrying the remains of Yosef, they had time to go ahead and get themselves purified before Pesach. Remember again, we have this image of like the Jews traveling all over the place during their 40 years in the desert. It's not true. We were stationary most of the time. So if you know that Pesach is coming, and you know that your job is to go ahead and carry the remains of Yosef, there is a way to purify yourself 7 days in advance of Pesach. There's a way to do it. There's a way to do it. Similarly, in Mishav al Safan hayu, Yicholin hayu litar. Same idea. Even if it was Mishal and al Safan who were caring for the remains of Nadav and Avihu, they could have gone ahead and purified themselves when? But remember again, when do Nadav and Avihu die? Essentially, again, right after Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So there was the opportunity to go ahead and, in other words, either way, there was time. Whether you were carrying the remains of Nadav and Avihu or you're carrying the remains of Yosef, there was time to purify yourself in advance of Pesach. So who were these people? Right? So also Rabbi Yitzchak is disagreeing with both Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yosef Alili. He says, who were these people? Ella oskin b'meis mitzvah hayu. We'll say, who are these people who came to Moshe? Somebody died. Somebody died in the midbar. And I will say the person was a meis mitzvah. Now, we'll say this to me is fascinating because ultimately, again, now remember, what's a meis mitzvah? A meis mitzvah is someone who has no one to bury him. So we'll say, if you look at Rashi says, Tamei meis mitzvah, Lav meis mitzvah davka ka'amar, dafilu meiseya nami meis mitzvah kariluhu. The mitzvah is haspen. Supposed to say Rashi is bothered by this because the general definition of meis mitzvah is somebody dies and there is no one to take care of their burial needs for them. Rashi says it can't be that it's a literal meis mitzvah. It can't be it's a meis mitzvah. Why? Because in the desert everybody had someone ultimately to take care of them. So it can't be a real meis mitzvah. Rashi just says meis mitzvah just means that what? There was a mitzvah to help bury someone. Say, I'll tell you the truth. I think that, not to be cholik on Rashi, but I think one can make the argument that maybe it really was a meis mitzvah. Because we'll say, in every society, there's always people who are on the periphery. It's the nature of human relationship dynamics that there are always people who are marginalized. It's just the way that it is. So it could be Pashup Pshat in the Gemara is that maybe even in the midbar there were meis mitzvah. As heartbreaking as that sounds, I will say it's the same way that when Amalek attacked, where did Amalek attack? Hanechashalim acharecha, the stragglers. How could there be stragglers, right? It's a big camp, but don't you think we'd all take care of each other? There are always stragglers, right? There are always people who are left behind. There are always people on the periphery. There are always people who are marginalized. That is just the nature of human relationship dynamics. So maybe meis mitzvah really means that there were people who died in the midbar and there was no one to attend to them. Baruch Hashem, Am Yisrael Rachmanim b'nei Rachmanim. There's always someone to attend to them. In any event, Rabbi Yitzchak says that's how they became tamei through meis mitzvah. Shechal shvi shalahen lios berev Pesach. I will say, so what happened? What happened to these Jews? There was a meis mitzvah. They had no choice but to take care of the dead. And it turned out, remember again, if you contract tumas meis, so you remember, how do you get purified? Para aduma, sprinkling when? Days 3, day 7, but you don't actually become tar until when? Till night 8. So what happened with these guys? They became tamei meis mitzvah. And ultimately, again, they weren't going to become tamei until the night of Pesach. The problem means, therefore, that's what? They were tamei on Erev Pesach, which is the time that you offer up the Korban Pesach. Now, remember again, we actually saw the Succah Psachim, right? About could someone count towards a Chabura if they can't eat now, but they will be able to eat tonight? A whole discussion we saw in Psachim. And even the Gemara says, because after all, the Shneimar, because they came to Moshe Rabbeinu and they said, we can't perform the Pesach today. Their problem was, we can't perform the Pesach today. But ultimately, again, tomorrow they would be able to. So they were stuck. These individuals were unable to go ahead and participate on Pesach and Erev Pesach, so they missed the window by a couple of hours. So they came to Moshe for Pesach Sheni. They said, Lama Nigara, why should we lose out? So I'll say, point over here is, you see what happened. Ultimately, again, they did not engage in Pesach Rishon. Why did they not engage in Pesach Rishon? Why did they not engage? Because you're telling Rabbi say, now listen, now you have to understand the way the Gemara is understanding this over here. So let's go with whichever one it is. Carrying the remains of Yosef, Mishala and Safan carrying for Nadav and Avihu, Rabbi Yitzchak that it was a mace mitzvah. Think about this just a moment, we'll say. Let's illustrate it, especially with the last one, the mace mitzvah. Right? We're all together, and someone died, right? So now what happens? We know that if we go ahead and we take care of this person right now, what's going to happen? No Pesach for us. So I can make the argument that, you know what? Let's leave him. I mean, I'm not leaving. We could cover him up. Cover him up. We'll come back after we offer up the Korban Pesach. It's a rachmanus. But if you have to make a choice over here. We bury you, miss Pesach, or we maybe leave you, do Pesach, and then come back for you afterwards. The fact that they buried him tells us that what? Osek b'mitzvah patra min mitzvah. Right? So they made the calculation that said, no, we're going to bury you. Because halacha l'maisa, even though we're going to miss Pesach, because essentially if we bury you now, pretty much we're patra from Pesach. Which I will say, it makes sense. I'll tell you what, I remember when they come to Moshe Rabbeinu, right? The wording they used for Moshe Rabbeinu was what? Lama nigara. Why should we lose out? In other words, they weren't saying this out, we did something wrong, we missed Pesach. We recognized we were exempt from Pesach. We were exempt. We don't want to be exempt. we want to have our mason. I was going to say have our mason eat it too, but that doesn't matter. We want to bury our mason, eat our Pesach too, right? We want to be able to go and have both. We don't want the exemption. So we'll say this is osek b'mitzvah patra min mitzvah. So here you see this seems to be the makar for osek b'mitzvah patra min mitzvah. I will say this is even, if you think about it, this is even a stronger makar. Why? Because this actually happened, right? This was a ma'aseh shaya kachaya. This is what occurred. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why we need both cases. Hasam, the Gemara says, tzricha. The truth is, you need to learn out both. You still need Shema. Why? Hasam, because if you would have just learned it out over here by Pesach Sheni, Hasam mishum dalo matas man chiyuv with the Pesach. We'll say it's different over here because in this case over here, there wasn't a conflict yet, right? The conflict wasn't the present conflict. Right now, right? Well, so let's go to Rabbi Yitzchak, the Mace Mitzvah. How many mitzvahs did they have in front of them at that moment? How many mitzvahs? One, right? There was no direct clash between two mitzvahs right now. There was one mitzvah of burying the mace right now. Pesach would come later on. So, Hasa mishum delo matazman chiyuv de Pesach. Aval hacha de matazman kriyashma emalo. See, Rabbi say, I'm at a thought. Look at Rashi for just a moment. The lo matazman chiyuva keshenitmu adayin lo higia zman achilas Pesach. Aval kriyashma de matazman chiyuv b'soch achopa. See, I will say, if you would just learn out from the Pesach case, I would say that case is different because at the time that they buried the mace, there was not yet any obligation of Kriyas Shema. There was not any obligation of Kriyas Shema. So I'm sorry, of Pesach. Of Pesach. So perhaps that's the case where we say, "Oh, sekum mitzvah patam min mitzvah." Ultimately, again, because at the time that you performed one mitzvah, there was no competing mitzvah. Okay, it happened to be because you performed A, you can no longer perform B. But in the case of Kriyas Shema, where ultimately both mitzvahs are before you, perhaps there is no exemption. Therefore, tzricha v'yashmin and hacha b'shum deleka kares. And furthermore, if it would have just taught us in the case of Kriyas Shema that a chassan is patur from Shema, okay, because there's no chiyuv kares if you don't recite Shema. However, aval hasam diika kares imalo. I might have thought that maybe by Karban Pesach, maybe Rabbi will say, maybe the halacha is what? Maybe the halacha should be that if you see a corpse in front of you and it's within 7 days of Pesach, maybe what should you do? What should you do? Sounds crazy. Leave it. Leave it. Don't bury it. Because that's going to preclude you from offering up Karban Pesach. And failure to offer up Karban Pesach results in kares. Therefore, again, tzricha. Therefore, we'll say, halacha l'maisa tzricha, you have to, so really, tzricha means no, even though you're going to miss Karban Pesach, you still have to bury the mace. So we'll say, so essentially, we really have two sources for the concept of osik b'mitzvah, patur min mitzvah. Source number one is by Kriyas Shema. Source number two is by Pesach Sheni. And what they're really teaching is as follows. The Kriyas Shema source teaches me direct conflict. When I'm engaged in mitzvah A, and therefore, and now I'm actively engaged in A, and now mitzvah B comes along, my active engagement in A goes ahead and exempts me from B. The Pesach Sheni situation teaches me that I'm permitted to perform a mitzvah, even though what? I know that the performance of A is going to what? Preclude me from going ahead and performing B. And that's okay because it's osik b'mitzvah, patur min mitzvah. You can take care of the mace even within 7 days of Pesach, even though you know that is going to preclude you ultimately from performing Karban Pesach. So it's really, they're both illustrating the same concept. Osik b'mitzvah, patur min mitzvah, but two different types of exclusions. One, or I should say, two different types of not exclusions. Conflicts, right? One is direct conflict, one is delayed conflict. But the concept ultimately remains the same, that whenever you're involved in one mitzvah, you're actively exempted from the performance of the other. I will say, it's also just an interesting yesod. In general, the Seder Karban Pesach is, like there's a shaila in halacha. I think the Kitzer actually brings down this case, that there was a person who was incarcerated. He didn't do anything wrong. I just want to point out, right? He wasn't. No one ever died. He was incarcerated, right? And he was by the authorities, and he was given 1 day leave. And they told him that he could either go ahead and leave prison, on the Shabbos or whatever tomorrow, or Yom Kippur, right? He had 1 day. So the Shiloh should I leave tomorrow? Right? Because it was a whole thing else. He could put on tefillin tomorrow. He could be out in Yom Kippur. So I believe this is brought down in the Kitzer. So the halacha says, take tomorrow, right? In other words, don't when it comes to the performance of mitzvahs, we don't go ahead. It ties into what we were speaking about yesterday. We don't go ahead and delay present opportunity for some type of future opportunity. So I will say same idea. The mace mitzvah is here, so you don't go ahead and delay the performance of the mace mitzvah. Ultimately, again, because of Pesach. Because remember, again, when you're burying that mace mitzvah, when you see that mace mitzvah in front of you, right now you're choosing between two mitzvahs, mace mitzvah or Pesach, and you can't do both. Because once you become tamei and it's within 7 days of Pesach, you are out. You're out. But halacha l'maisa, it's the mitzvah b'aliyah, dechal tach mitzana. The halacha is when you have the opportunity to perform a mitzvah, you do it now. You don't worry about the future ramifications or repercussions. And again, even though taking the opportunity now may preclude you from doing something in the future, you still take it. Rabbi say, listen to what the Gemara does now. This is incredible. So the Gemara says, Gufa. So Rabbi say, let's go back to something we said just a few moments ago. So what we have over here now is two different forms of osik b'mitzvah, patur min mitzvah. Right? One in which there is an active clash on performing mitzvah A, and now mitzvah B comes along. Like Tosa said, assuming that I can't perform them at the same time, it's okay. The active performance of mitzvah A exempting from mitzvah B. Chasam teaches us that even if there's not actual physical performance, but what? Tirda, mental preoccupation with the mitzvah. Mental preoccupation with the mitzvah is like active involvement in the mitzvah, and therefore the chasam is patur from Kriyas Shema. Now, third level of osik mitzvah patur min mitzvah means I'm allowed to perform mitzvah A, even though I know that what? When performing A, that is going to actively prevent me from performing B, like we saw by the case of mace mitzvah and Karban Pesach. Now watch this. Let's go back and talk about something else. Gufa. Amar Rabbi Abba Bar Zabda Amar Rav. Avil Chay B'Chala Mitzvah Samuras B'Torah Chutz Mitzvah. Also, we saw this before. To remember again, an Avel is obligated in all mitzvahs except for tefillin. Now, I just want to point out over here, this is the halacha of tefillin on the first day of Shiva. An Avel does not put on tefillin on the first day of Shiva. Now, the truth is, the way this happens more often is as follows. An Avel during Aninos, right? Remember, the period between death and burial is exempted from all mitzvot saseh. That's actually a din of osek b'mitzvah pater min mitzvah. The aval is actively involved in kavod hameis, arranging for the levaya, writing a hesped, right? So therefore, again, actively involved. In addition to that, on the first day of Shiva, an aval does not put on tefillin. Now the truth is, more often than not, people don't think about this. Why? Because more often than not, what ends up happening is you're not putting on tefillin on the first day of Shiva anyway. Why? Because usually a person is still in Aninos, right? Like the relative passed away. The levaya is not that. It's not at sunrise. It's at 9 o'clock. It's at 10. Whenever it's going to be. So by the time you finish the levaya, it's already afternoon. So often the aval doesn't think about it. But on the first day of Shiva, the aval is not putting on tefillin. Not putting on tefillin. So let's say, for example, you had the levaya at 7 o'clock in the morning. 7 o'clock in the morning, or for that matter, in Eretz Yisrael they bury at night. So you had levaya at night. The first day of Shiva, an avel does not wear tefillin. There's a whole discussion in the poskim. Can an avel put on tefillin if he wants to, right? So the avel is exempted. It's a shalin halacha. Is it a forced patur? Is it an optional patur? Okay, but we'll go with an avel does not wear tefillin on the first day of his avelos. So the Gemara says, so avel is chayiv in all mitzvahs in the Torah, with the exception of tefillin. Chutz mitzvah shari nemar bahen fe'er. Because we'll say ultimately again, the Navi uses lashon of fe'er. Fe'er means glory or a crown. Where do we see this from? Midu amrli rachmana li Yecheskel pe'ercha chavush alecha. We'll say Yecheskel, right? Yecheskel, after his wife had passed away, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells him that he's not permitted to engage in normative mourning practices. So Pe'ercha chavush alecha, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Yecheskel, your glory should be bound upon you. That's a reference to tefillin. So the Moshe was telling Yecheskel Hanavi, you have to wear tefillin even though you're in Abeos, even though it's the first day of your Shiva. Atu de mechayeves. Yecheskel, it's you who's obligated in tefillin. You who's obligated in tefillin. However, again, about kuli alma ptiri, but everyone else is pater. When is an avel pater from tefillin? V'hani mili biyom rishon. Right? When is an avel pater from tefillin? The first day of Shiva. Avel doesn't put on tefillin first day of Shiva. Dichsiv v'acharisa kiyom mar. Because the pasuk says, and after the death, is a bitter day, which the Gemara understands to mean that what? The primary feeling of sadness over loss is felt on the first day of Shiva. So again, the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Yecheskel, keep your tefillin on, indicates to us what? That under normal circumstances, what would happen? An avel would not wear tefillin. An avel wouldn't wear tefillin. Ayva Amar Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda Amar Rav, Avel chayiv b'sukkah. Yet Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda said the name of Rav that an avel is chayiv in sukkah. So pshita, isn't that obvious that an avel is chayiv in sukkah? And I was supposed to say, why would you have a havmin of the avel? So we'll say. So again, remember we had this before. That we wanted to suggest maybe an avel should be pater from mitzvahs in general. Why? Mental preoccupation with one's mourning. To which the Gemara says no. An avel is chayiv in all mitzvahs. The only mitzvah an aval is pater from is tefillin, and when? On day one. So the Gemara says, furthermore, to reinforce this, an aval is chayiv in sukkah. So we'll say, let's say again, now the truth is, remember, this doesn't really happen, right? Why doesn't this happen, that an aval is chayiv in sukkah? Because again, in Manav Shach, if the person was sitting Shiva before Sukkot, so remember again, Yom Tov comes and cuts off the Shiva. If Rahman a person lost a relative on Sukkot, everything is delayed until afterwards. Now, I'll tell you where this does come up. halacha l'maisa. Let's say someone loses one of the zayin, one of the 7 relatives on Sukkot, right? So remember again, we delay Shiva, we bury on Yom Tiv, we technically bury Yom Tiv Sheni, Chalamayid, right? We push off the Shiva till afterwards. There are certain mourning practices that do apply even over the course of Yom Tiv itself. Certain dvarim shebetzina, certain private displays. So the Gemara says over here that aval is chayv in Sukkah. So pshita, of course, an aval is chayv in Sukkah. Mountain, what would you have thought? Both listen to this. Hova Amar Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda Amar Rav Mitztayer Patur Min Sukkah. Hi Nami Mitztayer. So I would have thought as follows. Since we say this is great, I mean not great. Mitztayer is Patur from Sukkah. Now both say. Now we're going to talk about this sugya. What does it mean a mitzvah? Who's a mitzvah? Who's a mitzvah? Someone who's very uncomfortable. Someone who's very uncomfortable. So someone who is in discomfort is patur from sukkah. So I might have thought, hi nami mitzvah. The aval is also a mitzvah, right? The aval is an incredible tsar. To which the Gemara says, no. To which the Gemara says, kamash malon hani mili tsara dimemela. They will say, when do we say that mitzvah is patur from sukkah? That's when what? When the tsar comes from what? Comes from what? Your sukkah. Rashi points out there, tsara de memela, shasukkah mitzara, so kigon, chama, otzina, osir, chabdron, shasichim. Both say, it's too hot, it's too cold, right? Whatever. So meaning the tsar itself comes from the sukkah experience. That's right, it's raining. That's the patur of mitzvah. Both say, listen to these words. Aval hacha, when it comes to avelos, ihu dekametzaer nafshe. If the avel is in tsar, that's his own decision, right? That's his own decision. Kametzaer nafshe. He's causing himself ultimately again to be in a state of sadness. Iboy le liyisuve daite. He should go ahead and make himself feel better. So I'll say this is a very loaded Gemara. So first of all, just on a halachic level, this is very interesting. The patur of mitzvah, right? The patur ultimately again of quote unquote discomfort is ultimately again a din in when the tsar comes from the sukkah itself. But when you're in a state of tsar, but your tsar has nothing to do with the sukkah, ultimately what? Ultimately again, halacha l'maisa, that's not the patur mitzvah. So listen to what the Gemara says. Therefore, if a person just lost a loved one and they are in a state of emotional tsar, the Gemara says, listen to the words Rabbi say. So therefore, again, I'm not patur from sukkah. Fine, that's the halacha. But look how the Gemara understands the notion of feelings. Ihu dekametzaer nafshe. Rabbi say, if you're sad in life, who's responsible for that sadness? Who's responsible? You. Which Chazal are telling us something incredibly amazing. You decide how you feel. You decide how you feel. You cannot go ahead and control what happens around you, but you absolutely control your emotional reactions to what happens around you. You suffered loss. How you allow that loss to impact you is your own decision. You control how you feel, which Rabbi say is such a dramatic idea in Chazal. And look what Chazal said, Iboile liyasuve daite. Get yourself together. Get yourself together. Rabbi say it's such an incredible yesod, because no offense to the psychologists, right? But sometimes it's all about embrace your feelings. I mean, it's all important. It's great. But again, sometimes it's also put on your big boy pants, right? And sometimes it's also about you control how you feel. You can't control what happens to you. And you often can't control what's done to you and what's perpetrated upon you and the circumstances around you. But you absolutely control how you allow circumstances to impact you. Or to say it a little bit differently, sometimes you don't control how circumstances impact you initially. Because sometimes things happen to you and there's an initial impact that just hits you like a tidal wave. But then you have to get yourself together and then you have an absolute obligation to control how things continue to impact you on an ongoing basis. It's such an incredible issue. The Rambam writes about this in Hilchos Deis. This is incredible. The Rambam says that in life, you're supposed to have a mixture of all types of midos, with one exception, kas, right? Anger, Rambam says, is the most destructive midah. You can't have any level of kas. Truth is, even the Rambam kind of backs, you have to have some level of kas, right? But again, can't have kas. So the Rambam says, what happens if a person has a short fuse and has a lot of kas? So listen to the Rambam's incredible sagely advice. I have a problem with the temper, and I'm always getting angry. What's the Maimonidean solution to a short fuse? Stop getting angry. That's the Rambam. I could have been the Rambam, right? Stop getting angry. But do you understand the godless of that advice? The Rambam says, you control it. You have a short fuse? Lengthen it, right? You have a bad temper? Fix it. Stop playing the role of the victim, right? Because also we don't realize we so often do this life. This is who I am, almost like I'm a victim of circumstance. This is who I am. I have no control over this persona. I have no control over this identity. I have no control over these midos. Almost, this is how HaKadosh Baruch Hu made me. No, look what Chazal say. Ihu dekamitzaer nafshei iboy leilia suve daite. Rabbi say this is a mantra. You control how you feel. You don't like it, change it. And Rabbi say again, obviously with the caveat that sometimes things happen to us in life, and there's an initial reaction that happens so quickly that almost like kiviyachal, I don't have total control over it. But then afterwards, I have control to get myself back together. I have my control to get myself back on the rails. I control ultimately how I feel. But say such an incredible yisod. Let's go a little bit weiter, then we'll stop. Chasan. So we'll listen to this interesting sugya as well. Actually, we'll stop over for today. We'll pick up in Mir Hashem tomorrow with the sugya of Chasan, which is another incredible sugya. So again, we emerge with two sources, Ostik b'mitzvah, patam in mitzvah. We also emerge again with cognitive preoccupation. Cognitive preoccupation only applies to cognitive preoccupation of mitzvah, does not apply ultimately again to any type of non-mitzvah cognitive preoccupation. Continuing Mir Hashem with the case of Chasan. Mir Hashem tomorrow. Shkoyach.